There's unprecedented gridlock in Washington, federal policies encouraging states to act in ways that are antithetical to their values, and of course the general importance of establishing relationships with policymakers at all levels. I personally have seen the impact of that state and local advocacy can have in California, where I'm part of Reform California. Yay, go team. And in just the past few years, we've been able to make positive impact on legislation ranging from immigration to affordable housing, from climate change to criminal justice reform. In the process, we've built relationships where none had existed between California congregations from San Diego to Sacramento, with legislators across the state, and with our governor. Our guests this morning know firsthand the tremendous impact that state and local policymakers have on the lives of us, their constituents. Governor Jack Markell, to my far right, served as Delaware's governor. He was governor of Delaware from 2009 to 2017. His full biography is in the program, and I ask you to read it there so we can save time for discussion here. But he is just a remarkable man with remarkable accomplishments, and I want to add that he is a member of URJ Congregation Beth Emmet in Wilmington, and more importantly, his son is a former Lataken participant. Mayor Darrell Steinberg was sworn in this past January as mayor of Sacramento after serving in the California legislature. In the legislature, he most recently served as the Senate Pro Tem, and his biography is also in the book. He's also wonderful, and I want to add that he's a member of my own congregation, Congregation B'nai Israel in Sacramento, where his wife Julie is our cantor, and their son Ari is a NIFTY alum. So we are just delighted to have both of you with us. I now have to do my Liz Dunst moment of technology. We are going to have a conversation between all of us. If you are watching on Facebook Live, we're thrilled to have you. And to those of you who are online and in the room, please share the live stream on your Facebook page, and to top Liz Dunst on this one, tweet, post on Facebook and Instagram, and be sure to tag the RAC and use our hashtag RAC17. So please first welcome Governor Markell and Mayor Steinberg. Hello, there we go. So we can get to know you both a little bit better. I'd ask you each to talk a little bit about how you first got involved in politics, why you did, and not to play to the crowd or anything, whether your Jewish identity had any role in that decision. So, Governor, why don't you go first?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. And I do want to give a special shout out to the folks from Congregation Beth Emmet and everybody in Wilmington. So, I grew up in Newark, Delaware. It's a small town, university town, and I spent pretty much 95% of my first 16 years within a 3-mile radius of my high school. But the summer after my junior year of high school, my parents, my father was a university professor, my parents said, sorry, but you're not going to be around for your senior year, because my dad took a sabbatical, spending half the year in England and half the year in New Zealand. This was for my senior year of high school. And I said, I'm not going to go. And they said, yes, you are. And they won. There's no question. I mean, to me, the most important part of being Jewish and the most important of the affiliation is around Tikkun Olam, and this idea that we actually do have a responsibility to make the world a better place and to leave it better than we found it. And so, to me, those two things have really tied in together, and that was my real motivation for getting involved in public service.
For me, first of all, thank you as well for having. Should we try again? How's that? Okay. Thank you for having me. A shout out to Congregation B'nai Israel in Sacramento and Rabbi Mona Alfie here. Thank you. and all our congregants. My, I think, formative experience was age 24. I was a law student at UC Davis. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and decided to attend law school in Davis. And in 1983, prior to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the law school was rather progressive in admitting students with significant disabilities. But the law school itself was not accessible. And I was the tutor for a couple of students who were quadriplegic, one one of the last polio victims, one who had been injured in an auto accident, and the moot courtroom of the law school was inaccessible. They had to do their trial practice in a small classroom downstairs while the rest of us got to be in a real courtroom or a facsimile of a courtroom with a jury box and all of that. And we decided together to fight for a lift. And the law school told us that while they wanted to build the lift, that they didn't have the money to do it. And I took that answer at face value, but kept going back and going back. When can we get the money? When can we get the money? And finally, I decided to go outside the law school to the main university and asked one of the associate deans of facilities, when could we get the money? And he said, we offered the law school the money months ago. They turned it down because they didn't want to change the aesthetic look of the moot courtroom. And I said, did they put that in writing? And the dean said, yes. I said, would you mind if I got a copy of the letter? He said, yes. I had that letter on the front page of the Davis paper, and within 4 months the lift was built. And so that, to me, that was my first taste of how just being a normal person, how if you decided to be an advocate, that you could actually have power. And that advocacy could actually lead to something significant. And so I became a lawyer and continued my interest in politics. And all of that is as a result of the Jewish values I was taught from my earliest days. It is tikkun olam, but it's also being learned. It's also being educated and being prepared so that you can translate that tikkun olam into a real result.
So, Darrell, you kind of touched on this. This is a very unique moment in American history, I think, for all of us. And we're all sort of used to working on issues at a federal level. Working on state and levels can be kind of new for some of us. And I'm wondering if both of you could offer some observations, both in terms of the role that you see states and cities playing in policies at this point, and if there are particular areas that you think we as activists and as people who care might have the ability to have an impact.
So I have, in my years of doing this, obviously learned some lessons. And one of them is that if you want to be effective, it is really important to focus. I can't overstate that. There are so many ways to heal the world and so many ills in the world that we all as advocates have a choice around what we want to focus on. And when I ran for the legislature back in 1998, I saw that no one was working on the issue of mental health. And I got advice from a predecessor of mine who said, in a term-limited environment, we have term limits in California, choose one or two things that really matter that no one else is working on. Don't pick the thing that is highest on the political pop charts, because you may be the co-author of the biggest bill in the world, but what are you going to put your energy into where you alone, in coalition with others, can make a difference? And that's partly how I chose mental health. And I think working at the state and local level, that it's important to choose what you want to do. The RAC has been very effective here in California. They looked at immigration, for example, back in 2013 and said, well, God, there's so many aspects of the immigration question. They chose to work on the role of law enforcement, what law enforcement can and cannot do when an undocumented immigrant happens to end up in a California jail. They called it the Trust Act. And RAC led the way to pass a major bill that limited the ability of sheriffs and police officers to work with the immigration police in ways that would lead to the deportation of a lot of people. That was focus. And I think to be effective, you got to take these big issues and break them down and figure out, okay, what's the one thing or two things that may help thousands of people where your advocacy can lead to either the passage of a bill, an ordinance, or a change that will be very meaningful.
So I agree with everything that the mayor just said, and I want to build on it. I think it's very important that people in your position, and I go back to something he said in his opening comments when you realized what a profound difference you could make as sort of a normal person. You were not in elective office when you were in law school, but you made it happen. I think the potential exists within all of us to have that kind of impact if we're strategic about it. And so in addition to the point that the mayor made about focus, I would say it's really important that you humanize, for those who are in a position to make a difference, the face of the problem that you're trying to solve. And I want to give you a specific example. About 15 years ago, I was the state treasurer of Delaware, very new in my position, and I went to visit a Delaware employer that happened to be a very good employer of people with disabilities. And I met a young man. He was 25 years old at the time. He had Down syndrome. And he had a job at a bank. He was making T-shirts as a promotional item for the bank. And he was so excited to have this job, and I asked him about the job, and he told me that, I asked him, I said, what did you do before you got the job? And he told me that he had sat at home for 6 years watching TV with his parents. And a light bulb went off in my head that if I ever had the opportunity to work on something at a big scale, I really wanted to focus on this issue, because the truth is there are millions of people around the country with disabilities who would love to work, who could add value, but who are so often not given a chance. And so eventually I became governor, and I had the opportunity to serve for a year as a chair of the National Governors Association. And there aren't actually any perks that go with that job. But it's a one-year term, and everybody who's in that position gets to choose one issue for governors across the country to focus on. And so the issue that I chose was, in fact, employment for people with disabilities. And now, as a result of that, and it's really as a result of meeting that one guy, there are governors across the country, Democrats and Republicans alike, who are really moving the needle on this issue. And so often we get caught up in these statistics and in the numbers, and the statistics and the numbers are important. But it's really, and the particular value that you all can add is to make sure that the policymakers, the legislators, the mayors, the governors have in their mind the picture of a real person with a real story, with a real family behind them. And that's how you move the needle.
Any of you, either of you, see a difference in terms of how activists and people who are concerned about an issue relate to state and local representatives, as opposed to working the Hill or writing Congress, writing senators, writing the president? Is there a difference in terms of how people should be interacting with people, how those relationships are developed?
I think to me, the best is to be in their face. It's to be in their face. And I mean that in a respectful way. And I think it's something that at a local level, California is probably a little more challenging than a place like Delaware for sure. But even in California, the more direct the interaction you have. And I think we're seeing is now, I think one of the reasons that the repeal and replace is running into problems is because so many elected officials, when they're going back to their home districts and they're having these town hall meetings, and they're hearing directly, very directly, from their constituents about the concerns that their constituents have. And so at the end of the day, I think it's, again, in the idea of being strategic, what that means is elected officials want to hear from people who can vote for them. And so it's one thing for advocacy groups to get in their face, but it's much more valuable if their own constituents, when you're organizing, if you can organize their constituents, to phone them, to mail them, to visit them. I mean, I think by far that's been When people were most effective with me, it's because they came, they told real stories, they were respectful, but they told real stories. And probably the best example for me was around the death penalty. And having visits, they had a lot of Delawareans come visit me, but they also made it very real, having people who had been on death row and who had been exonerated and got out. And it just, the more real that you can make this for the elected officials, the more successful you're likely to be.
Politicians, of course, appreciate support, but even more than support, they notice when people are unhappy with them. They do, especially their own voters. Well, obviously their own voters. And so to be organized in an intelligent and effective way and to present an argument when an elected official is not paying attention to what he or she should be paying attention to, and I think the healthcare debate recently is a very good example of that, makes a real difference. The politician, no matter how high up he or she is, knows when there is an organized group of constituents who have an issue with either a stand they're taking or that they're not being vocal enough on behalf of an issue that they should be more vocal on. And so it matters. It matters more, frankly, than the lengthy petition or sort of the canned emails. I mean, there's some things where you know a broader organization has organized your constituency. That's less impactful to me than the actual person-to-person meetings, either at a community meeting, a community setting, or in the legislator's office where they know that there are a group of constituents who are very concerned about the position that they're taking. Very impactful because you want support, but more than that, you don't want a group of people who are unhappy with you, especially if you know in your own mind that you haven't paid sufficient attention to that issue.
What's been your experience in terms of dealing with groups from the progressive religious community? What's the role that you see for them, for congregations, people of faith, other progressive denominations like the Reform movement, in affecting social change?
I've had the experience, and again, in California, the RAC has been very effective. The rabbis and the lay leadership have actually worked to be the lead voice on significant legislation in California. It's the Trust Act. In my last year in the legislature, we had the cap and trade issue, the climate change issue, and I decided that I wanted to seek to ensure that some of those resources went to affordable housing consistent with our climate change goals, because I figured that was a very good intersection of two compelling social issues. And it was the religious community, the faith community, that provided me the backup to be able to get that done. And as Jennifer points out, and I don't know whether this was in your introduction or not, but you're not at the point, this organization, where the governor seeks you out for support when it comes to some of the governor's issues. And it's not just the Jewish community. I've seen it with the interfaith work as well. Whether it's area congregations together, we call them locally, very focused. They pick their sets of issues, and then they drive change in greater Sacramento. And so you can do anything you want as long as it's focused and effective.
Agreed. I agree with him so much. I actually think he'd be a great governor. But you're welcome. So no, I do agree, and I think that the potential for the faith community is to be the conscience of a community. But I think if that is the aspiration, you got to be very careful, and you have to live that value. And what I'm referring to is you cannot then be demonizing the people with whom you disagree. We have so much of that today in society. There's so much vitriol, there's so much division. And I'm not talking about the sort of just, the typical safe spaces and the political correctness and the like. But if, in fact, if you do want to be the conscience of the community, speaking up for the most vulnerable, you've got to do so in a way that is aspirational. And you can disagree with elected officials, but the moment that you flip it and you decide that those who may support an elected official that you don't like is, as a result of that, a bad person or the enemy, I think you can lose your higher ground.
I want to put a fine point on the governor's comments. There is a place in politics for righteous indignation, but all heart without a head and without civility and respect usually ends up as just that, righteous indignation. Take the immigration issue, for example. Why aren't we making an argument that immigration is essential for the business community in the modern economy? Our heart and our heart and our Jewish values speak to the fact that there should never be the other. We never shut people out. We must be inclusive. God, our history speaks volumes, but the heart is where you begin, but it's combining the heart and the head, where you make the persuasive argument that isn't afraid to look at the other side, so to speak, or where they may be coming from, and trying to merge the heart and the head to win the argument. It's not enough to just care more than the other side. It's a matter of winning. When people's lives are on the line here, it's a matter of making the persuasive argument in court and in the public square.
And it's at these moments that folks like you really need to have the back of the elected officials who are doing the right thing. Right. And I'll give you a specific example. I don't know, probably a year ago, whenever it was, that the Syrian refugee issue was so front and center. I spoke up. I went on with Wolf Blitzer. I went on with Chris Matthews. I did an op-ed for CNN about the need for us to be, certainly we need to be secure in our vetting, but we needed to be true to our values. And for people in this audience, I'm sure many of you, if most of you, will remember the ship to St. Louis. And when I went out and I said we need to be true to our values, and there's nothing in the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness clause. There's no exemption to people who are Muslim. I received by far the most phone calls to my office on any issue that I acted on during 8 years, and they ran about 99.5% to 0.5% against my position. And I didn't care because I believed deeply in what I said, but I was also in my second term. I was term limited. I didn't really have to worry about the politics. I'd like to think I would have done the same thing in the first term, but the point is, for the next elected official who is staking out that kind of position, it sure would be nice if folks like you organized a lot of phone calls in support so that they know that they're not alone.
I feel bad. I should have called.
To talk about one of those kinds of issues now, and I think Mayor Steinberg, you may have something to say on this. President Trump has been saying that he's going to respond to cities that have said that their law enforcement are going to use discretion in reporting immigration status to ICE by stripping those cities of eligibility for grants. Is this realistic? What's been your experience over the last few weeks as this has sort of come to the forefront? And what can we be doing to both help you and to encourage better relationships between law enforcement and immigrant communities in local and state level?
Sure. Thank you. This is an issue, of course, that's become front and center as a number of California cities and cities throughout the country have designated themselves proudly as safe havens or sanctuary cities, and Sacramento is one of them. Again, I think it's the combination of the head and the heart. I make the case to my constituents that, number one, his executive order is unconstitutional. It violates the 10th Amendment, and Judge Orrick in San Francisco held thus last week. But secondly, this is a matter of American values. We do not exclude people. And we specifically do not exclude people who came to this country as kids, undocumented, dreamers who are just doing their very best to take part in the Californian American dream. And we don't discriminate against hardworking families regardless of their immigration status. And then I make the head argument again that our law enforcement community, they don't want to become immigration police. They have enough to do to combat crime in our cities without doing the job of the federal government. And then I go back to the heart and I say, you know what? If they're going to strip a federal grant from us, I guess that's the price, because I'm not, in my city, trading civil rights for money. Period. End of story. As an American Jew, I couldn't do so. And then in some safe audiences, I say, if you want me to do otherwise, get a different mayor, because I'm not doing it. So that's my answer. And you know, thus far, at every community meeting where this comes up, there's one or two people who strongly disagree. And I try to listen and not get into a fight and respect their point of view. But you make your point of view clear. And you know, the last thing is, we all know this, when you cower to a bully, the bully
about how the United States dealt with the Jews who wanted to leave Europe in the late 30s and I guess early 40s. It is not a proud history. And the question is, you know, that was the abandonment of the Jews. The question is this going to be the abandonment by the Jews? And I think we all have these questions to ask ourselves, and I think what better forum than the RAC?
Can I steal that line, by the way? When I go back? Okay, it's good. It's really good.
I want to go back to healthcare. We talked about health. I want to go back to healthcare, which we just spoke about briefly in passing. We've sort of been dodging some bullets lately, and we've had a lot of scares, and who knows how things are going to end up with the ACA. And for those states that didn't expand Medicaid, there's a lot of pressure to do the expansion to help more people now. For people who are living in those states, and I know we have people here from them, what can they be doing to encourage their legislators, their governors, to take action to increase coverage in those states?
So my experience has been, of all the decisions I had to make as governor over 8 years, the decision to expand Medicaid was probably literally the easiest, because the math was so clear. You got to cover a lot of additional people, which meant that they were going to get health care in an appropriate setting rather than having to go to the most expensive place of all. It was by far the right decision for the state's budget. And at least at the time, and things may have changed a little bit, but I mean, to me, the states that made other decisions, it was totally political. It was totally political. And I do think that you are saying now, and I don't know exactly how this latest effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act is going to end up. But I was just reading an article this morning that there are, and I know this is a bipartisan group, but I am reading more and more about there being some more centrist and moderate Republicans who are recognizing that the politics of this is a lot more complicated than they thought it was before the election, because there are a lot of people in their districts who really get the value. And I think some of what we have seen, which a lot of it I think has been organic, some of it has been organized over these last several months, has been very powerful, and I think we all ought to take a lesson from that. The value of elected officials hearing directly from people who can vote for them about issues that matter in a respectful but forceful way. And particularly when people hear from constituents whose lives may have been saved because of a particular change in health policy, somebody else who they're really concerned about the future health of their loved ones because of decisions that have not been made. Marry the stories with the statistics and do so in a personal way, and I think at the end of the day that's the most powerful way to make the argument.
I think one of the most cowardly parts of politics is when a politician or a political body asks and answers half a question. And the half question in this instance is, well, what is wrong with the Affordable Care Act? And you can point to rising premiums in some instances, and that it is not perfect. But our responsibility, our collective responsibility, is to make sure that the political bodies, state by state, and the Congress answer the full question, which is that how are you going to fix it? And what is the alternative if you don't fix it? And I think this is where, as the governor said, the stories of endless lines in emergency rooms and people who didn't have coverage before, who now have coverage, what that has meant to their lives. I think the frame of this must be, what are you going to put in its place? It is the replace question that is going to assure that people who are ill get the medical care that they need and deserve.
So we just have a minute or two left, and I just wanted to ask both of you if you have a room of 800 people here who would love to be involved on state and local issues and levels. So if you have some closing thoughts and some remarks that you would like to give us in terms of advice for going forward from here, we would very much appreciate hearing them.
Thank you. And thank you again. What an honor to be with the governor and to be with all of you. I like these sort of phrases because they remind me and center me sometimes on what's important. The one that I want to share with you to end is what someone once told me about two kinds of people in politics. They're the short-termers and the long-timers. The short-termers are those who get mad or passionate about an issue, and they get involved, and then they recognize just how hard it is. Just how hard it is to make real progress, to change a social condition, to pass a law, to make a difference. And because it's hard, and sometimes you don't win the first time, or you don't make as much progress as you would like, the short-timers bow out. Now, they're not bad people. They just choose to do something else with their lives. But over the long haul, they don't necessarily make a difference. And then there are the long-termers, those who recognize that you have to look back over 5 or 10 years or a lifetime and say, wow, we made this amount of progress every year, but look at what we accomplished over time. And they're the ones who are willing to bear sort of sometimes the indignities, the difficulties, the frustrations, the changing winners and losers in elections, but they can look back and say they made a difference. You're all here because I'm confident you are not the short-termers, but the long-timers. And I encourage you to continue to do so and to be so. Thank you.
Let me close with two quick stories. The first one, I do so a little bit reluctantly because I understand there are like 100 rabbis here, and I may get this reference wrong. I'm sure Rabbi Robinson will tell me if I do. But there's a place in Genesis where Abraham is described as rich. But the word that's used, kaved. Are you a rabbi? You're nodding. I hope you're a rabbi. Good. All right. I'm feeling so much better. The interpretation of kaved, rich, but really burdened. And with your richness, with your wealth, comes a responsibility. And I think it's a very powerful place in the Bible where basically saying that you have this responsibility when you have the opportunity and you have the ability to act on it. Which leads me to the second story. And it has to do with Martin Luther King. So in 1963, Dr. King went to Birmingham, Alabama. He believed that it was the most segregated city in the world, in the country, and he went there to lead a nonviolent protest. And when he got to Birmingham, he was arrested, and he was put in jail. And when he got to jail, he received a letter from the members of the clergy, which I think included a rabbi, a letter from members of the clergy in Birmingham. Now, this letter wasn't actually sent to him directly. It was published in the form of an open letter in the Birmingham newspaper. And essentially what the letter said to Dr. King is, Dr. King, you should not have come to Birmingham. You're stirring the pot. And if you had just waited, everything would have turned out okay. So he's sitting there in Birmingham, in the jail. He gets this letter, and he wants to respond to it. And he has nothing to write on but the fringes of that newspaper, and he has nothing to write with but the stub of a pencil. But with that stub of a pencil, he begins to write an incredible document. It's called The Letter from a Birmingham City Jail. And in it, if you haven't read it, read it. And in it, among other things, he writes that we will have to repent in our generation, not just for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but also for the appalling silence of the good people. And maybe this is a group that I really don't have to share that story with, because you're taking your own time to be here, to actually act, and you know that refraining from bad is not sufficient, but we actually have to act and not be silent. But I think if, this is a huge crowd, and if you all go back to your communities and you recruit additional people to do, as Dr. King said, to do give the responsibility as Abraham had, think of the amazing progress that we can all make together.
Join me in thanking two remarkable public servants who I know everybody wishes were their very own. Thank you so much to both of you.